Here is something that does not appear in any standard history of communication. Before the governments of the modern world built their postal systems, something else was already running. Not a primitive network of foot messengers, not scattered couriers serving individual kings. Something older, faster, more geographically coordinated than the official timeline of institutional development can account for. A system so sophisticated, so architecturally embedded in the cities and roads of the pre-industrial world, that when the new governments came to absorb and replace it, they didn't build from empty ground. They took over infrastructure that was already there, already old, already running. And then, within the same 30-year window, they demolished most of what they had taken over and called it modernization. Let's start with what we're told. The history of human communication, according to the textbooks, is a clean arc. Tribal runners, royal couriers, medieval messenger guilds, evolving naturally into private postal companies, which were eventually consolidated and nationalized into the ordered global infrastructure we recognize today. It's a story of organic development, local to regional, regional to national, national to international. The natural result of expanding trade, growing populations, and the increasing complexity of modern governance. That's the story. But here's the first anomaly. Within a single 30-year window, from roughly 1840 to 1870, every major government in the industrialized world moved simultaneously to establish legal monopolies over the transmission of written communication. Not some governments, not a coalition of aligned political systems sharing a common ideology. Every single one. Britain passed its Postal Reform Act in 1840. The United States moved to criminalize private postal competition in 1845. Prussia nationalized its postal apparatus in 1848. Austria in 1850. France reorganized its state postal authority in 1854. The German states consolidated under what would become the Reichspost. Japan, within years of the Meiji Restoration of 1868, abolished its feudal courier networks entirely and replaced them with a centralized state system. By the founding of the Universal Postal Union in Bern in 1874, the global consolidation was complete. Every nation, every political system, constitutional monarchies, republics, empires, newly formed states, the same conclusion, the same solution, the same window. The official explanation says this was the march of administrative rationality, the natural result of industrial development, the inevitable logic of modern governance applied to the movement of information. But consider what was there before, the Thurn und Taxis family. This is not a fringe reference, not an obscure footnote recovered from a contested archive. This appears in the mainstream institutional histories of European communication without controversy or qualification. A single private family operated a postal relay network across the Holy Roman Empire beginning in the early 1500s. By the 18th century, that network ran through more than 11,000 post offices, crossing the territories of hundreds of competing kingdoms, religious authorities, and independent city-states that shared almost nothing else. The system worked reliably enough that merchants, diplomats, scholars, and private citizens across a geographically fractured continent used it as a matter of daily infrastructure for 3 centuries. Letters moved from Venice to Brussels, from Prague to Madrid, from Vienna to Amsterdam, not through any government's authority, not through any political structure, but through one private family's inherited network. When Prussia absorbed the Thurn und Taxis operation in 1867, the family was compensated. The figure recorded in official documents was 3 million thalers for a postal network. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly were they compensating? Because here is what the official history moves past in a single paragraph. The Thurn und Taxis relay stations, the physical buildings at specific intervals along specific routes that made 3 centuries of operation possible, had in many cases been running for 200 and 300 years before the Prussian absorption. Some had construction records, many did not. Several of the oldest stations appear in the earliest available regional surveys, already fully integrated into the urban fabric, with no documented moment of having been built, no founding records, no architectural plans, no correspondence about their establishment. Buildings that simply appear in city records as operational, already there, already running. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In what is now Pakistan, British colonial administrators documented an elaborate relay station network already in place when they arrived in the Punjab in the 1840s. Not built by the Mughal administration they had displaced, not attributable to any earlier regional power they could identify with confidence. Simply there, operational, used by local populations with the matter-of-fact familiarity of infrastructure, so old no one could clearly account for its origin. The British catalogued it, incorporated it briefly into their own operations, and then replaced it wholesale within 20 years. The original structures were largely cleared during railway infrastructure development in the 1860s and 70s. The clearance was not preceded by architectural survey. No comprehensive study of what was removed was conducted before removal. In Peru, the Inca Chasqui system, a network of relay runners covering thousands of miles of Andean terrain, transmitting messages from Cusco to the edges of the empire in days. Official history calls this administrative genius, Incan ingenuity. The Tambo way stations that housed the runners, built at specific intervals along the road network, were described in several documented instances by early Spanish observers not as fresh construction, but as already old, already worn into the mountain landscape in ways that seemed, to the chroniclers who noted it, inconsistent with the official founding chronology of the Inca state itself. The standard explanation is that the Incas inherited infrastructure from earlier Andean cultures. That explanation is offered and then rarely followed to its logical conclusion. In China, the imperial courier system of the Tang and Song dynasties made use of fixed relay stations at intervals of approximately 30 li along major roads. The official history credits their construction to successive imperial administrations. The architectural surveys of surviving stations, and there are very few, note consistently that the oldest remaining structures show evidence of repair and reconstruction layered over foundations whose original construction dates cannot be determined with confidence. Foundations whose engineering, in at least one documented case, reviewed by a researcher whose paper appeared in a specialist journal in 1987 and has not been widely cited since, appears inconsistent with the construction methods of the administrations credited with building them. Here's the strangest part. When I started looking not at the postal systems themselves, but at the buildings, the physical relay stations, and post houses that made these networks materially possible, I found the same documentation problem I have encountered every time I have looked carefully at pre-1900 institutional architecture. Records of operation without records of construction. Buildings whose founding dates are listed in regional archives as unknown or approximate or simply absent. Structures described in the oldest available surveys as already ancient and then demolished systematically in the same window as everything else. The relay stations of the Thurn and taxis network in the German territories, gone, not repurposed, not converted and preserved as historical sites, not incorporated into new postal infrastructure with any attempt at architectural study. Demolished during the rationalization drives of the late 19th century, the old post houses along the French Royal Road network, a system so extensive it had required its own professional class, its own architectural typology, its own internal legal structure, almost universally cleared during the administrative modernization drives of the early 19th century. The ancient caravanserai of the Persian and Anatolian transit routes, structures that had served as communication and logistics nodes for centuries, a substantial proportion cleared during the Ottoman administrative reform period of the 1860s and 70s, replaced by telegraph lines and newly constructed facilities. The evidence suggests something much larger was being quietly concluded. Let me describe the coordination problem plainly, because I think it deserves to stand on its own without qualification. For the simultaneous nationalization of global postal infrastructure to be explained through organic historical development, you would need several things to be true at the same time. You would need governments in London, Washington, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, Tokyo, and beyond to all independently conclude within the same 30-year window that private communication networks posed an administrative problem requiring state absorption. You would need those governments operating across actively competing political systems and ongoing military rivalries to arrive at structurally identical legal solutions. You would need the physical infrastructure they absorbed to be demolished and replaced without public debate about what was being lost. And you would need all of this to happen without a coordinating body, without a recorded summit, without a manifesto, without a document connecting the parallel decisions of governments that otherwise agreed on almost nothing. The official history says yes. All of that happened independently because the idea of the state postal monopoly was correct and correct ideas spread. But ideas do not demolish buildings. Ideas do not synchronize the physical removal of relay infrastructure across competing empires within a 30-year window. What does that is funding? What does that is institutional coordination? What does that is something that understood precisely what it was replacing and moved deliberately to ensure it would not be studied before it was erased. This is where the economic logic becomes impossible to ignore. A private communication network operating at the scale the pre-nationalization systems appear to have reached represents something specific in economic terms. It represents an independent channel, a channel for the movement of information, of financial instruction, of trade correspondence, of political coordination that exists outside the observation of the state. A letter moving through the Thurn taxis network in 1800 passed through private infrastructure, handled by private employees, routed through private relay stations. The state could not routinely intercept it, could not systematically monitor the volume and pattern of correspondence, could not observe what was being said between parties using infrastructure it did not control. After nationalization, every letter moved through government infrastructure. Every postal employee became a government employee. Every relay point became a government facility. Every piece of correspondence, in principle, observable to the authority that now operated the channel. I am not claiming surveillance was the stated motive. I want to be precise about that. I am noting that surveillance capability was the documented result, regardless of what the stated motive was. And I am asking whether it is coincidental that this result was achieved globally, simultaneously, through a process that also involved the physical demolition of the infrastructure that preceded it. Because here is a detail that the official history of postal reform consistently underweights. The nationalization process in every country involved not just legal transfer of ownership, but physical replacement. The new post offices, built in the 1850s, 60s and 70s, were architecturally distinct from what they replaced. Designed for administration, for the systematic documentation of correspondence, for bureaucratic processing, and the older buildings they replaced, the ones that went down rather than being converted, were in documented cases structurally different in ways that have attracted almost no scholarly attention. A researcher I corresponded with had spent years documenting surviving pre-nationalization post-house structures in the Alpine regions of Austria and southern Germany. The structures that had survived by being converted to taverns or private residences, the ones that hadn't been officially demolished, had a recurring architectural feature she found difficult to account for. The central rooms had ceilings disproportionately high for the documented function of relay administration. The walls were thicker than the climate required, and several of the structures contained what appeared to be acoustic chambers, interior spaces with curved internal geometry designed to carry and focus sound, built directly into the fabric of the buildings with no operational explanation under any documented use case for a postal relay station. This raises a simple but critical question. What were these buildings doing beyond what we have been told they were doing? I am not answering that. I am asking it. Because the pattern of over-engineering of structures built substantially beyond the requirements of their stated function appears every time I have looked carefully at pre-1900 institutional architecture. The hospitals with their bell towers and resonant healing wards, the asylums with their acoustic treatment chambers, the exposition halls built to cathedral scale for events lasting 6 months. And now the post houses with their thick walls, their high ceilings built for acoustics rather than administration, and their resonating sub-basement chambers whose purpose was apparently not recorded by the people who used them for 300 years. All of them gone. All of them replaced within the same window. All of them leaving almost no physical trace. Let me be specific about one documented case, because I think the specificity matters. The Frankfurt am Main General Post Office, the Thurn on Taxi's headquarters that stood on the Eschenheimer Gasse, served as the operational center for one of the largest private communication networks in European history for more than 3 centuries. It was demolished in 1896. A new post office was constructed on a separate site. The demolition records, held in the Frankfurt City Archive, note the removal of several architectural elements, including, and I want to quote this precisely, resonating chambers in the sub-basement level, the purpose of which is not recorded in the operational documentation of the facility. Not recorded. In the operational documentation of a building that maintained meticulous records of correspondence volume, routing, staffing, and supply costs for 300 years. Why would a building designed for the sorting and forwarding of letters require resonating chambers in its sub-basement? Why does the organization that operated that building for 3 centuries have no documentation of what those chambers were for? No one seems to ask this question. I started asking it. Now I want to talk about the maps, because the maps are where the official explanation doesn't just strain, it collapses. There are cartographic documents held in major institutional archives across Europe, produced in the 16th and 17th centuries, that depict road networks and relay points in regions that were not, according to the official exploration timeline, accessible to European cartographers at the time the maps were produced. Not obscure fringe documents. Maps held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in Florentine collections, in Habsburg imperial archives, maps depicting road networks with waypoints marked at intervals. Intervals consistent with the operational logic of a pre-modern communication relay system. In regions of Central Asia, of Sub-Saharan Africa, of the South American interior, that European explorers would not formally reach and map for another century or more after these documents were drawn. The standard explanation is that these maps were compiled from older source material, transmitted through trade networks, copied from records produced by now unidentifiable travelers. That explanation is itself a confession. It admits that someone had been in those regions, had surveyed the road networks, had marked the relay intervals, had left records detailed enough to survive centuries of transmission and still appear in 16th century European cartography with enough geographic accuracy to be recognized. It simply declines to ask who. And here is where this thread connects to something the official history of communication is structurally unable to accommodate. If you follow the demolition pattern, the same 30 years in which private relay infrastructure was absorbed, replaced, and physically cleared across every government that had access to it, and you ask not merely why it was replaced, but what it actually was, a different set of questions becomes available. The relay stations that appeared in colonial records already old, the post houses with no construction records, the acoustic chambers whose function was not recorded even by the organizations that operated them for centuries, the road networks appearing on maps drawn before anyone was supposed to have been there to map them. What if the infrastructure that was nationalized and demolished between 1840 and 1870 was not built by the civilizations that absorbed it? What if it was inherited? I cannot prove that. I want to be clear about what I am and am not claiming. What I can demonstrate is the pattern, the documentation gap, the architectural anomalies, the synchronized physical demolition, the cartographic evidence of networks that predate the civilizations credited with their construction. What I cannot demonstrate is the origin, but I can ask whether the origin was the reason for the demolition. Because there is a detail about the Universal Postal Union, the body established in Bern in 1874 to govern the newly nationalized global postal order, that the standard historical literature does not adequately explain. The founding members of the Universal Postal Union included nations that were, at the moment of founding, in active military conflict, or within years of having been so. Prussia and France had fought the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The Ottoman Empire and Russia were in ongoing territorial conflict. British and French imperial interests were competing violently across Africa and Asia. These governments could not agree on borders, could not agree on trade, could not agree on the rights of their own populations, and yet they agreed with precision and speed on the legal architecture of global information governance. You would need to explain that. You would need to explain how competing empires, with every reason to obstruct each other's administrative interests, arrived, in the same decade, at a coordinated international framework for managing the movement of written information globally. Who convened that agreement? Who had the institutional reach to bring those parties to the same table on this specific subject? And why, in the same decade, were the physical remnants of the system being replaced by that agreement being demolished across every continent where Western infrastructure had penetrated? The official history calls it the progress of administrative rationality. The silence around these questions is not the silence of questions that were never raised. It is the silence of questions raised and then set aside, of committees formed and then not reported upon, of researchers who looked carefully and published in journals that folded before their work could be incorporated into the mainstream literature, of archive collections catalogued but not digitized, accessible only to those willing to spend months in physical review of documents held in institutions that do not advertise their holdings. That kind of silence is not an absence, it is a structure, and structures are built for purposes. Let me leave you with the questions I cannot answer, because I think they deserve to stand without qualification. Why did 300 years of Thurn Taxi's operational records not include documentation of the purpose of architectural features built into their own headquarters? Why did the nationalisation window of 1840 to 1870 involve the physical demolition of most pre-existing relay infrastructure rather than its preservation and architectural study? Why do pre-modern cartographic sources depict road networks with relay intervals in regions that had not been formally explored by any civilization credited with the knowledge? Why do the surviving structures of the old postal infrastructure share unexplained architectural features, acoustic chambers, disproportionate ceiling heights, walls thicker than the climate required, with every other category of pre-1900 institutional building demolished in the same window? Why did colonial powers on every continent discover pre-existing communication infrastructure in the territories they absorbed? And why did they universally replace rather than study it? Why does the founding of the Universal Postal Union, a moment of extraordinary coordination between actively competing imperial governments, receive almost no scholarly scrutiny as an event requiring explanation? And why, in every archive, in every language, in every institutional record I have been able to examine, does the same window appear, the same 30 years, the same categories of structure, the same pattern of absorption, replacement, and physical erasure, not in one country, not in one language, everywhere, all at once, followed by a silence that has lasted 150 years? What was moving through those relay stations that the new system was not designed to carry? What did the acoustic chambers in the sub-basements of the old post houses amplify, and for whom, and to what purpose, that 3 centuries of operation never required documentation? What road networks exist beneath the ones we use today, marked on maps drawn by hands we have not named, running between points whose purpose we have not been permitted to ask about? I don't know. I genuinely don't know, but I know what the pattern suggests. I know what it feels like to read these demolition records in sequence, to watch the same institutional logic repeat itself across languages and empires and competing governments that should have had every reason to preserve what they were absorbing and no apparent reason to agree on destroying it simultaneously. It feels like someone changed the frequency, and whatever was moving through those relay stations, through those acoustically chambered post houses, and those road networks that appear on maps drawn before anyone was supposed to have found them, went quiet, all at once, everywhere, and the silence that followed was called the modern postal system.